The alarm in my collar buzzed 3 seconds before the first tremor hit the floor beneath my feet, and in that small gap of time, I remember thinking, quite clearly, that something on this station was about to go very wrong. My name is Doran Vessel. I have worked as a liaison officer at the Halcyon Academy for 11 cycles, which is a long time by the standards of my people, the Threll. We are not a species that enjoys surprises. We plan, we schedule, we file reports before we file complaints. So when the floor shivered under a corridor that had not shivered in 11 years, my first instinct was not fear. It was irritation. I assumed a cargo shuttle had docked too hard again. I was wrong. I am getting ahead of myself, though. Let me start from where this really began. 3 days earlier, in a classroom that smelled faintly of ozone and printed paper, with a girl who never once raised her hand. Halcyon Academy sits on a neutral ring station at the edge of 3 overlapping territories, built long before I was assigned here, as a place where young minds from different worlds could study together without their governments getting nervous about it. Species from a dozen systems send their brightest here. It is supposed to be safe. It is supposed to be boring. Most days it is. Among this year's new arrivals was a small group from a planet most of the galaxy still refers to, quietly and a little nervously, as a Deathworld, Earth. I had read the files before they arrived. Gravity heavier than comfortable, weather that tries to kill you for fun, predators in nearly every biome including the oceans, including the skies, including, apparently, each other. The Threll Council had approved the exchange program mostly out of curiosity, and partly because refusing it would have looked rude. I was assigned 3 human students. 2 of them behaved exactly as I expected. Loud, curious, constantly hungry, always 5 minutes late. The third one did not. Her name was Nora Bennett, 17 years old by her planet's counting, quiet in a way that made the room feel quieter around her. She sat in the back row of every class, took no notes, asked no questions, and somehow scored higher than anyone else when exams came around. I remember the first time I called her name during attendance. She did not say, "Here." She simply raised 2 fingers, once, and went back to looking at the door. Always the door. I noticed that early. Whatever room she was in, she picked the seat with the clearest view of the exit, and she never sat with her back to it. I mentioned this to one of my colleagues, a Threll instructor named Sorrel Cade, who laughed it off as a cultural quirk. Earth had wars, after all. Recent ones. Perhaps the habit had followed her off the planet. I did not think much more of it. I had paperwork to file and 40 other students to worry about, most of whom caused actual problems, unlike the quiet girl in the back row who caused none at all. The other 2 human students, a boy named Ethan Marsh and a girl named Priya Rao, filled the silence Nora left behind. Ethan told jokes that only sometimes landed. Priya argued philosophy with our resident Kethrani student, a tall, patient being named Osa Vel, who found the whole idea of human debate both baffling and delightful. Between the 3 of them, Earth's reputation at Halcyon slowly shifted from the death world nobody understands to the surprisingly normal kids who eat strange food and laugh too loud in the dining hall. Nobody laughed loud around Nora. She was polite. She was helpful when asked. She simply did not invite conversation, and after a while, most students stopped trying. I only spoke with her directly once before everything changed. It was during a combat theory seminar, a mandatory class that covered the basics of galactic conflict resolution, mostly diplomatic history, with a light dusting of tactics, meant for students who would never actually need to use any of it. I was observing that day, standing near the back of the room, when the instructor asked a simple question about defensive formations. Nora answered without raising her hand. She simply spoke, calm and precise, correcting a diagram on the board that showed a formation with an exposed flank. The instructor blinked, checked the reference material, and admitted she was right. A few students clapped. Nora did not smile. She just looked, briefly, satisfied, the way someone looks when a math problem finally balances, and then she went back to staring at the door. Afterward, I caught up with her in the hallway. mostly out of professional curiosity. That was a good catch, I told her. Most students never look past the diagram. She shrugged. It's basic stuff. You don't leave a gap like that unless you want someone to walk through it. Where did you learn that? She looked at me for a moment, the kind of look that measures a person before deciding how much to say. School, she said, finally. Back home. I remember thinking that was an odd thing to learn in school. I did not push further. I had a meeting to attend, and a dozen more important things on my schedule that day. Things that felt important at the time, and now feel almost embarrassing to remember, because none of them mattered even a little compared to what was coming. That was 3 days before the alarm. On the morning it happened, the Academy was hosting what we called an open ring day, when family members and dignitaries from partner systems were permitted to visit the station. Traffic through the docking bays tripled. Security protocols relaxed, just slightly, just enough to let more shuttles through without the usual delays. Nobody thought much of it. Open ring days happened every cycle without incident. I was walking Nora's class toward the observation deck for a scheduled tour when my collar buzzed. Not the gentle chime that meant a schedule change, the sharp 3-pulse buzz that meant something had breached station perimeter without clearance. I stopped walking. Around me, 40 students kept moving for a few more steps before they noticed I had stopped, the way a school of fish notices a shift in current a beat too late. Instructor? Osavelle asked, tilting her long neck toward me. I did not answer right away because the floor moved. Not much. A tremor, brief and low, the kind you might mistake for a heavy shuttle docking too fast if you had never felt an actual impact before. I had never felt an actual impact before. Neither had most of the people around me. That was the entire point of Halcyon Academy. It was supposed to be the one place in this quadrant where nothing like this happened. The lights along the corridor ceiling flickered from soft white to a pulsing amber, and a voice I did not recognize came over the station intercom, calm in a way that somehow made everything worse. Attention! Unidentified vessels have breached the outer docking ring. All students and staff proceed immediately to designated shelter zones. This is not a drill. For 1 full second, nobody moved. 40 students stood frozen in a hallway built for calm mornings and boring lectures, staring at each other, waiting for someone to explain that this was a mistake, a malfunction, a test nobody had told them about. I turned to find Nora already gone from her place in the group. She was standing near the observation window instead, not looking at me, not looking at the panicking students around her. She was looking down the corridor, toward the sound of the alarm, with an expression I had never seen on her face before and would never fully forget afterward. She did not look afraid. She looked like she had been expecting this her whole life, and some small, quiet part of her had simply been waiting for it to finally arrive. "Miss Bennett," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "Shelter zone. Now." She turned to look at me, and for just a moment, something passed behind her eyes that I could not name at the time. Later, I would understand it perfectly. In that moment, I only knew it made the hair along my arms stand upright. "Get the others moving," she said. "I'll catch up." She did not catch up. That was the last time I saw her for nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes that would end with 3 armed intruders lying motionless in a service corridor. 20 minutes that would quietly and permanently change how I understood the quiet species from the Deathworld sitting in the back row of my classroom. But I am still getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what happened next, exactly as I lived through it, starting with the moment the first explosion tore through the lower docking ring and the true scale of what was happening finally became impossible to ignore. The corridor lights died completely for 3 full seconds before the emergency systems caught up, and in that darkness, 40 students screamed at once, a sound I had never heard on this station before and prayed I would never hear again. I was wrong about that too. I would hear far worse before the day was over. When the emergency lights finally caught up, the corridor looked like a different place entirely. The soft white glow was gone, replaced by pulsing amber that turned every face around me into something unfamiliar. Students who had laughed together at breakfast were now pressed against the walls, some crying, some too shocked to make any sound at all. I did what my training told me to do. I raised my voice, told everyone to link hands, told them to follow the amber floor lighting toward Shelter Zone 3, the nearest one on this level. Osavel helped me herd the group, her long limbs useful for keeping panicking students from scattering in different directions. Ethan Marsh was near the front, one arm around a smaller student who could not stop shaking. Priya Rao counted heads out loud, over and over, as if the number would stay the same if she just kept checking it. It did not stay the same. We were missing one. "Where is Nora?" Priya asked, her voice cracking on the name. I looked back down the corridor we had just come from, the one leading toward the observation deck, toward the sound of the alarm, toward whatever was happening on the lower docking ring. I did not see her. I had told her to catch up. I had assumed, foolishly, that a 17-year-old exchange student would do exactly that. She was right behind us, Ethan said, though his voice suggested he did not believe it either. I made a decision that I have replayed in my mind many times since, and I still am not certain it was the right one. I told Osavel to take the group the rest of the way to Shelter Zone 3, and I turned back to find the missing student myself. It was my responsibility. She was 17. This was not her home, not her station, not her fight, whatever this turned out to be. The corridor behind us was empty, and much darker than it had been moments before. Several of the light panels shattered, or simply dead. I called her name twice. No answer. I moved further down the hall, past the observation deck where she had been standing, past a viewport that now showed something I never expected to see from inside Halcyon Academy. Small craft, sleek and matte black, moving through the docking ring with the kind of coordinated aggression that meant this was not an accident and not a misunderstanding. This was an assault. I counted 6 vessels before I stopped counting, because counting them did not change anything, and because a new sound had reached me from further down the corridor, something sharp and metallic, followed by a short, human cry that was not a scream of fear. It was a grunt of effort. I moved toward it faster than I probably should have, given that I am not, and have never claimed to be, someone built for confrontation. Threll bodies are built for negotiation tables, not corridors filled with armed strangers. But something in that sound pulled me forward anyway, some instinct older than my training telling me a student of mine might be in danger, and my duty, whatever else was happening, had not changed. I found the source of the sound in a narrow service junction near the lower lift bank. 3 figures in dark, unmarked armor stood near the lift controls, weapons raised, clearly attempting to override the security lock that separated this level from the docking ring below. They had not noticed me yet, pressed against the corner of the junction as I was, and for one long, cowardly moment, I considered simply retreating and reporting their position from somewhere safer. Then I saw movement in the shadows behind them, low and fast, and I understood that I was not looking at 3 armed intruders about to breach a lift. I was looking at 3 armed intruders about to have a very bad afternoon. The movement resolved into a shape I recognized, though I almost did not believe my own eyes. Nora Bennett, moving along the wall in a crouch that made almost no sound against the metal floor, carrying what looked like a length of pipe she must have pulled from a damaged conduit somewhere along the corridor. She was not running toward the lift controls to help override them for the intruders. She was closing the distance behind the nearest one with the kind of focus I had only ever seen in Predator documentaries about her own planet. I opened my mouth to call out a warning, though to this day I could not tell you whether I meant to warn her or warn them, and before a single sound left me, she moved. It happened faster than I could properly follow. The pipe connected with the back of the nearest intruder's knee, dropping him hard, and before his companions could fully register what had happened, she was already past him, driving her shoulder into the second one's midsection with enough force to send him stumbling into the lift doors. The third intruder turned, weapon rising, and for one terrible second I was certain I was about to watch a 17-year-old girl die in front of me. She was already inside his guard before he finished turning. I do not know exactly what happened in the next half second, only that his weapon clattered to the floor, and he folded forward, and she stepped past him toward the first one, who was already trying to rise. I should say clearly, because I know how this might sound if I do not, that what I witnessed was efficient and controlled, not cruel. She did not linger over any of them. She moved from one to the next, the way a person might move through a checklist, each action precise, each motion spending exactly as much effort as it needed, and no more. Within perhaps 20 seconds, all three intruders were on the ground and no longer a threat to anyone. Nora straightened, breathing hard but steady, and looked down at the three of them for a moment before crouching to check something on the nearest one's armor. Only then did she seem to notice me standing frozen at the corner of the junction. Her expression did not change much. If anything, she looked mildly annoyed, the way someone looks when a coworker walks in during an awkward part of a difficult job. "You should be at Shelter Zone 3, she said. I found my voice after a moment, though it came out thinner than I intended. "I could say the same to you." She stood, wiping her palms on her uniform sleeve, and glanced toward the lift controls the intruders had been trying to override. They were going for the lower ring access. If that lift opens, whoever's down there gets a straight path up to the dormitory levels. She said this the way another student might describe a homework assignment, matter of fact, already thinking 2 steps ahead. I couldn't just leave it. "You could have told a security officer. There wasn't one here," she said simply. "There was me. I did not have a good response to that. I still do not, if I am honest." I looked down at the 3 intruders on the floor, still breathing, though clearly not in any condition to continue what they had started, and something in me, some old Threll instinct toward order and procedure, wanted very badly to file a report about proper protocol and unauthorized use of force by a minor exchange student. That instinct felt suddenly deeply foolish, standing in a corridor that had nearly been breached by armed strangers, while the rest of us hid and waited for someone else to handle it. "We need to move," Nora said, already walking toward the junction's far exit, the one leading deeper into the station rather than back toward the shelter zones. "If they sent 3 up this route, there are more coming through others. This station wasn't built to keep anyone out. It was built to keep everyone comfortable." I followed her, mostly because I could not think of anything better to do, and partly because some part of me no longer believed she needed my protection at all. If anything, the opposite seemed increasingly uncomfortably true. We had gone perhaps 30 meters when the first real explosion hit, somewhere below us, deep enough in the station's structure that the floor did not just tremble this time. It bucked, hard, throwing me against the wall and dropping Nora into a crouch that looked almost practiced, one hand flat against the floor for balance, the other instinctively out toward me to keep me from falling further. Alarms that had been steady before now shifted into a faster, more urgent pattern, and the intercom voice returned, no longer quite as calm as before. "All personnel, hull breach confirmed on lower ring, sections 4 through 7. Repeat, hull breach confirmed, emergency containment engaged. All personnel proceed to secondary shelter protocol immediately." Dust and debris drifted down from a ceiling panel that had cracked somewhere above us, and for the first time since the alarm first sounded, I felt something close to real, physical fear, the kind that makes your legs want to move in any direction as long as it is away from here. Nora did not look afraid. She looked, if anything, more alert, more present, the way a person looks when a puzzle they have been quietly working on has just handed them an important new piece. "That wasn't a breach from outside pressure," she said, mostly to herself, studying the direction the tremor had come from. "That was something inside going off. They're not just boarding, they're trying to cripple the station's systems first." "How could you possibly know that from a sound and a shake in the floor?" She glanced at me, and there was no arrogance in the look, only a kind of tired familiarity, as if this were a question she had answered before, in another place, to other people who had never needed to understand the answer until it was too late. "Where I grew up," she said, "you learn to read what a bad situation is telling you, or you don't get to grow up much further." Before I could ask what that meant, exactly, a new sound reached us from further down the corridor, Boots against metal flooring, several sets, moving with purpose, moving toward us. Nora's posture shifted instantly, the tired familiarity replaced by something colder and far more focused. She stepped in front of me without seeming to think about it at all, positioning her body between me and the sound, scanning the corridor for cover, for an exit, for anything she could use. "Get behind the support column," she said quietly. "And whatever happens next, don't come out until I tell you to." I want to say that I argued. I want to say that I insisted on standing beside her, that some deep well of Threll courage rose up in me at that moment, and refused to let a 17-year-old face armed intruders alone while I hid. I did not argue. I moved behind the column exactly as she told me to, my back pressed against cold metal, my hearts pounding harder than I had ever felt them pound in 11 quiet years at this academy, and I watched the girl from the back row of my classroom step forward to meet whatever was coming down that corridor, alone, calm, and utterly unafraid. I have relived the next several minutes many times since that day, usually late at night, usually when the station is quiet again and I am supposed to be sleeping. Each time, I notice something new, a detail I missed the first time, a piece of the sound I did not properly register while it was happening. It is strange how memory works when fear is involved. Some parts arrive sharp and clear, frozen forever in perfect detail. Other parts blur into a kind of gray noise that I cannot fully recover no matter how hard I try. What I remember clearly is this. 4 figures rounded the corner of the corridor, armored the same way the first 3 had been, weapons raised and already sweeping the space ahead of them with the kind of practiced efficiency that told me these were not amateurs, whatever else they were. They were trained, they were coordinated, and they very clearly did not expect what they found waiting for them. Nora did not wait for them to notice her first. She moved before their sweep reached her position, using a section of collapsed ceiling paneling as cover, closing the distance along the wall in a low, fast crouch that made almost no sound against the metal floor. I understood, watching her, that this was not instinct alone. This was practiced. Somewhere, at some point in her 17 years, someone had trained her to move exactly like this, and I found myself wondering, with a chill that had nothing to do with the station's ventilation, what kind of childhood produces a person who can do this without hesitation? The first intruder went down before his companions fully registered that anything was wrong, and in the half-second of confusion that followed, Nora used it completely. She did not try to fight all 4 of them evenly, the way I imagine someone with no real experience might attempt. She isolated them, using the narrow corridor and the fallen ceiling debris to keep them from surrounding her, forcing them to come at her one at a time, whether they wanted to or not. I will not pretend I understood everything I saw in that corridor. I am not a soldier. I have spent my career writing reports and mediating disputes between students from different star systems who disagreed about lunch schedules. But I understood enough to know that what I was watching was not luck, and it was not simple aggression. It was calculation, applied at a speed that left almost no room for her opponents to adjust. Within perhaps a minute, all 4 were down, disarmed, no longer any threat to anyone in that corridor. Nora stood among them, breathing hard, one hand pressed briefly against a scrape along her forearm that had opened at some point during the exchange, though she did not seem particularly bothered by it. "Columns clear," she called back to me, and I stepped out from behind it on legs that did not feel entirely steady. We did not have long to process what had happened before the deeper problem became clear. The corridor beyond the 4 fallen intruders led toward the Academy's central archive wing, a section of the station I knew well, full of research terminals, historical records, and, more urgently, a secondary shelter zone that housed nearly 60 younger students from the lower academic tiers. Nora was already moving toward it before I fully understood why. "They came from that direction," she said, nodding toward the archive wing, which means either they've already been through there or they're heading there next. Either way, we need to know which. "Nora, we should report this to security. Let trained personnel." "There isn't time," she said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that ended the conversation before it properly began. "And station security is spread thin across 6 breach points right now. I heard it on their channel." She tapped the side of a small device clipped to the fallen intruder's belt, one she must have taken in the moments I had been too shaken to notice. "They're listening to their own coordination too. I can hear what they're planning almost as fast as they can plan it." I did not know whether to be impressed or deeply unsettled by how calmly she said this. I settled, eventually, on both. We moved through the archive wing together, and it was here that I began to see the full scope of what this attack actually was, and how carefully it had been prepared. This was not a chaotic raid, this was methodical. Access panels along the research terminals had been forced open in ways that suggested the intruders were looking for something specific, not simply causing damage for its own sake. Storage drives were missing from at least 2 terminals we passed. A locked archive room that housed decades of interspecies treaty records stood with its door cut cleanly through, the edges still faintly warm. "They're not here to destroy the station," Nora said quietly, studying the cut door. "They're here to take something and cause enough damage that nobody notices exactly what's missing until it's too late to trace it." "How would you know that, just from looking at a door?" She glanced at me, and there was something almost sad in the look, though it passed quickly. "Because it's what I would do if I needed to steal something important without anyone realizing what I'd actually taken." I did not ask her to explain that further. Some part of me was not sure I wanted the answer. We reached the secondary shelter zone to find it, thankfully, still secure, sealed behind its reinforced doors with the younger students inside, frightened but safe. A tired-looking security officer named Halvo Wren stood guard outside, his weapon drawn, relief flooding his face when he recognized me. "Instructor vessel, thank the stars. We lost contact with the upper command deck 20 minutes ago. I don't know what's happening beyond this corridor." I opened my mouth to explain, though I barely knew where to begin, when Nora stepped forward instead, calm and direct in a way that made the exhausted officer straighten slightly, as if some part of him recognized competence when he saw it, regardless of the source. "There's a breach team working through the archive wing," she said. "At least 6 more armed, probably heading for the command deck to cut off station-wide communication entirely. If they succeed, nobody outside this station will know what's happening here until it's already over." Officer Wren stared at her, clearly trying to reconcile the calm, precise report with the teenage girl delivering it. "How do you know all that?" "Because I've been listening to their coordination channel for the last 10 minutes, she said, holding up the device she had taken earlier. "And because right now, I'm the only person on this level who's actually done something about it, instead of waiting for someone else to." There was no cruelty in how she said it, only a tired, flat honesty that I found, in that moment, impossible to argue with. Officer Wren looked at me, silently asking whether he should trust what he was hearing. I nodded, because whatever else I did not understand about the last 30 minutes, I understood that Nora Bennett had been right about every single thing so far, and I had no reason to believe that would change now. "The command deck," Wren said slowly. "That's 4 levels up, through the central transit shaft. If they're moving there now, we might be able to cut them off at the transit junction before they arrive." "Then let's go," Nora said, already moving. "I want to pause here and be honest about something, because I think it matters to whoever eventually hears this account. I was afraid. I am still, in many ways, afraid, remembering it. I am not built for corridors filled with armed strangers, and nothing in my 11 years at Halcyon Academy had prepared me for what I was about to walk into. But I followed her anyway, because some part of me understood, watching her move through that station with total, unshakable clarity, that staying behind and hoping someone else fixed this was no longer a real option. Too much had already happened. Too many people were counting on whoever was willing to act. The central transit shaft was a wide open space that connected every level of the station through a series of vertical lifts, normally crowded with students moving between classes. Now it stood empty and dim, most of its lighting knocked out by the earlier explosion, shadows pooling in corners that would normally have been brightly lit. We heard the breach team before we saw them, voices low and coordinated, moving up the emergency stairwell rather than risk the lifts, exactly as Nora had predicted from the intercepted channel. Officer Wren moved to take a defensive position near the stairwell entrance, weapon ready, and for a moment I believed this would simply be a matter of him holding the position until reinforcements arrived. Nora had other plans. Before Wren could fully settle into position, she was already moving past him, low and fast, toward a maintenance access panel set into the wall near the stairwell. I did not understand what she intended until she pulled it open, revealing a narrow service crawl space that ran parallel to the stairwell itself. "This connects to a maintenance junction 2 levels up," she said quietly. "If I go through here, I can come up behind them while they're focused on the stairwell entrance. 2 directions at once. They won't be ready for that." "That sounds extremely dangerous," I said, and I meant it as strongly as I have ever meant anything. "Most useful things are," she said, and there was the faintest trace of something almost like humor in her voice, though her eyes stayed serious. "Wren, give me 2 minutes, then make some noise at the stairwell entrance. Draw their attention toward you. I'll take it from the other side." Wren hesitated, glancing at me as if seeking permission I did not have the authority to give. But something in Nora's certainty was contagious, the way real competence often is, and after a moment he nodded and settled back into his position, weapon steady, watching the stairwell entrance with new purpose. Nora disappeared into the crawlspace without another word, and I was left standing beside a station security officer in a darkened transit shaft, listening to the sound of approaching boots grow steadily louder, trusting my safety and the safety of everyone in that shelter zone below to the calm, quiet judgment of a 17-year-old girl I had known for barely 3 weeks. The 2 minutes that followed were, without question, the longest 2 minutes of my entire life. When the breach team finally emerged from the stairwell, 6 of them, armored and alert, weapons sweeping the transit shaft with practiced precision, Officer Wren made his noise exactly as instructed, drawing their attention sharply toward his position near the entrance. I watched their formation shift instantly, weapons rising toward him, and for one horrible moment I was certain we had made a terrible miscalculation, that Wren was about to face 6 armed intruders entirely alone, while I stood frozen and useless nearby. Then the maintenance panel above the breach team's position burst open, and Nora dropped down into their formation from a height that should have injured anyone, landing in a controlled crouch that absorbed the impact with barely a sound. What followed happened faster than I could properly track, faster than anything I had witnessed in the archive wing corridor. She moved through their formation like water finding the fastest path downhill, never staying still long enough for more than one of them to fully bring a weapon to bear on her at once, using their own confusion and Wren's continued pressure from the stairwell entrance to keep them permanently off balance. I will not describe every detail of what happened in that shaft, partly because much of it happened too quickly for me to fully process in the moment, and partly because I do not think every detail needs to be described for the account to matter. 6 trained armed intruders entered that transit shaft with a clear mission and every advantage of preparation and equipment. Less than 2 minutes later, none of them remained standing, and the command deck 4 levels above us remained fully, completely secure. Nora straightened slowly in the aftermath, breathing hard, a fresh mark along her jaw that would bruise badly by evening, surveying the fallen intruders around her with the same tired, focused calm she had shown in every corridor before this one. Officer Wren lowered his weapon slowly, staring at her with an expression I recognized, because I imagine my own face looked much the same. It was not simple shock. It was the particular, disorienting feeling of watching everything you believed about a person, and perhaps about an entire species, quietly rearrange itself in the space of a few short minutes. "Who are you?" he asked, quietly, and I do not think he meant it as a question about her name. Nora looked at him for a long moment, then glanced toward me, and something in her expression softened, just slightly, the way it might soften around someone she had decided, somewhere in the chaos of the last hour, that she could trust. "I'm just a student," she said. "Class ended a little early today, that's all." It was. I would come to understand later, both a joke and the truest thing she said to either of us that entire afternoon. The command deck, when we finally reached it, was in worse condition than I expected. 2 consoles had been damaged in the earlier explosion, sparks occasionally spitting from a cracked panel near the main viewport, and the station's acting commander, a weary Kathrani administrator named Director Solvane, looked up at us with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent the last hour making decisions with far too little information. "Officer Wren," he said, relief plain in his voice, "please tell me the lower transit shaft is secure." "It is, sir," Wren said, and then, after a brief pause, added, "Thanks to Miss Bennett here." Director Solvane looked at Nora properly for the first time, taking in her torn sleeve, the bruise forming along her jaw, the calm, steady way she stood despite everything, and something in his expression shifted from exhaustion into a kind of careful, uncertain curiosity. "You're one of the exchange students," he said slowly, "from Earth." "Yes, sir." He did not ask the obvious question, though I could see it forming behind his eyes. How had a 17-year-old exchange student single-handedly cleared an armed breach team from the central transit shaft? I think, looking back, he already suspected he would not fully understand the answer, even if she gave him one, and there were more urgent matters demanding his attention regardless. "We've lost contact with 3 more sections of the station," he said instead, turning to a damaged display that flickered weakly beside him. "Sections 4 through 7 are confirmed breached. We believe the intruders are attempting to reach the primary data core, though we don't yet know why. Long-range communication is down, which means no distress signal has left this station since the attack began." "They cut it deliberately," Nora said. "Early. Before the first explosion even hit." Solvane looked at her sharply. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because it's the first thing I would do," she said, and there was no boast in the words, only a flat, tired honesty that seemed to unsettle the director more than any confident claim would have. "If nobody outside this station knows what's happening, nobody outside can send help, and nobody outside can ever verify exactly what was taken or how it was taken. Whoever planned this wants total control over the story afterward, not just control over what they steal today." A tense silence settled over the command deck. I watched Director Solvane process this, watched the careful, practiced calm of a lifetime spent in diplomacy struggle against the plain, ugly reality of what his station was actually facing. "The data core," he said finally. "If they reach it before we can restore any communication, they could take records going back decades, treaty archives, interspecies agreements, enough to destabilize half a dozen fragile alliances if released or altered the wrong way. Then we don't let them reach it," Nora said. "I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters. Up to this point, I had watched Nora Bennett move through this station reactively, responding to threats as they appeared in front of her, protecting whoever happened to be nearby. What happened next was different. This was the moment I watched her begin, quite deliberately, to take control of the situation itself. She asked Director Solvane for a full layout of the lower ring, every access point, every maintenance corridor, every possible route between the breach zones and the data core. She asked Officer Wren how many security personnel remained active and where they were currently positioned. She asked me, of all people, whether the Academy's emergency systems included any way to seal individual sections of the station remotely, cutting off routes rather than simply sounding alarms. I did know the answer to that, as it happened, having filed the compliance reports on the Academy's safety systems myself years earlier, and for the first time since the alarm first sounded, I felt genuinely useful rather than simply frightened and along for whatever happened next. Within a few minutes, Nora had assembled something that looked very much like an actual plan, built from pieces gathered across an entire station in chaos, from a security officer, an exhausted administrator, and a Threll bureaucrat who mostly filed paperwork for a living. I do not think any of us fully understood, in that moment, that we were watching someone with real training in exactly this kind of crisis, someone who had clearly done something like this before, somewhere, under circumstances none of us wanted to imagine too closely. The plan itself was straightforward once she laid it out: seal the remaining unbreached sections to prevent the intruders from spreading further. Use the handful of active security personnel to hold the two routes leading toward the data core, forcing any remaining intruders into a narrower, more predictable path. And somewhere in the middle of that narrowing path, Nora intended to be waiting. "That's not a job for a student," Director Solvane said, though the objection came out weaker than I think he intended, the exhaustion of the last hour clearly working against his own instincts. "That's not a job for anyone without proper training." "With respect, sir, I'm the only person on this station who's actually stopped anyone today," Nora said, not unkindly, but without any room for argument either. "I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what I'm going to do, because you deserve to know the plan before it happens, not after." I do not think Director Solvane had ever been spoken to quite that way in his long career, and I watched something complicated pass across his face, somewhere between offense and a kind of reluctant, dawning respect. "Then at least take Ren with you," he said finally. "I will," Nora said, "but Ren holds the North Junction. I need someone at the South, and Instructor Vessel knows this station's systems better than anyone else currently on this deck." I felt my hearts drop somewhere near my feet. "I am not a soldier," I said, perhaps too quickly. "I know," Nora said, and there was something almost gentle in how she said it. "You don't need to fight anyone. I just need someone at the South Junction control panel who can seal the corridor the second I signal you, before anyone can slip past. That's it. That's the whole job." Put that way, it felt almost manageable. I said yes before I had fully finished thinking it through, which is, I suppose, exactly the sort of thing people do in moments like that. What followed was the longest 40 minutes of my career, spent crouched beside a control panel in a narrow South Junction corridor, listening to distant sounds of movement and confrontation echo through the station's ventilation system, waiting for a signal from a 17-year-old girl who had, by that point, become the single most important person on this entire station, whether anyone had planned for that or not. The signal came just past the 40-minute mark, a sharp, 3-pulse tone through the small communicator Ren had given her earlier. I sealed the corridor exactly as instructed, watching the heavy door slide shut on the display feed, a moment before I heard, faintly, through the station's systems, the sound of the confrontation reaching its end. When I finally made my way to the data core access point, following Solvane's directions through corridors still hazy with drifting smoke, I found Nora standing amid the last of the intruders, 5 of them this time, all down, all no longer any threat, the heavy vault door to the data core still sealed and untouched behind her. She looked exhausted in a way I had not seen from her before, real fatigue finally showing through the calm, controlled focus she had maintained through everything else. But the data core was safe. The station was safe. And as I stood there in that quiet, damaged corridor, I realized something that struck me more forcefully than almost anything else that entire day. She was already working to remove every trace of what had actually happened. I watched her move methodically among the fallen intruders, checking their equipment, not for weapons or supplies, but for recording devices, for helmet cameras, for anything that might have captured footage of exactly what she had done and how she had done it. She found 3 such devices among the group, and rather than handing them over to station security as evidence, she quietly disabled each one, removing the storage drives and slipping them into a pocket of her torn uniform. "Nora," I said carefully, "what are you doing?" She did not look up right away, still working through the equipment of the last intruder, making sure nobody has a clean record of what just happened here. "Why would you want that? You saved this station. You saved dozens of people. Director Solvane should know exactly what you did, and so should whoever eventually investigates this attack." She finally straightened, and the look she gave me was tired and old in a way that 17 years should never produce in anyone. Because the moment there's a clean, verified record of what one human student can do against a trained breach team, this stops being a story about one lucky girl who happened to be in the right place, she said. It becomes a data point, and data points get studied and measured, and eventually, someone somewhere decides they need to know exactly how far that data point goes, and exactly how to counter it, or exactly how to use it. My planet already spent most of its own history fighting itself over exactly that kind of thinking. I'm not interested in handing the rest of the galaxy a reason to start doing the same thing to us. I did not have an answer to that. I am not certain there was a good answer to give. The official report will say the threat was repelled by combined station security and staff, she continued, already moving toward the next fallen intruder's equipment. That's true enough. It doesn't need my name attached to specifics nobody needs to know. Solvane will ask questions. Let him ask, she said. I'll answer the ones that matter, just not all of them. I helped her, in the end, though every careful, procedural instinct in me argued against it the entire time. We gathered what recording equipment we could find among the fallen intruders, and by the time station security finally arrived in force to secure the area and take the remaining prisoners into custody, there was remarkably little clear evidence of exactly how 5 armed breach team members had ended up defeated by a single exchange student and a data core protected by nothing more than a sealed door and a Threll bureaucrat with a control panel. Director Solvane, when he arrived shortly after, asked exactly the questions Nora had predicted he would. She answered them, calmly, honestly, and carefully, incompletely, describing enough of what happened to satisfy the basic requirements of an official incident report, without ever fully explaining the how behind any of it. I said very little during that conversation, mostly because I found I did not fully know how to explain what I had witnessed, even if I had wanted to. Some things, I was beginning to understand, are simpler to live through than they are to describe afterward, and simpler still to leave quietly, deliberately unrecorded. By the time the last damaged corridor had been resealed, and the final head count confirmed no casualties among students or staff, the sun equivalent through the station's outer viewports had shifted well past what should have been the end of a perfectly ordinary school day. Nora stood near the transit shaft entrance, the same one she had dropped into a breach team from barely an hour earlier, watching security personnel finish clearing the area, her expression unreadable. You could have told them everything, I said quietly, standing beside her. You could have let them see exactly what you're capable of. They would have called you a hero. She was quiet for a long moment before she answered, still watching the corridor, still watching the door, the way she always did. Where I'm from, she said finally, being seen as a hero and being seen as a threat usually turn out to be the same thing, once enough people are paying attention. I'd rather stay quiet a while longer. The official investigation into the attack on Halcyon Academy took 11 days to complete, and the report it produced, when it was finally released to the Academy's governing council, read almost nothing like what I had personally witnessed. It described a coordinated raid by an unaffiliated group attempting to steal sensitive treaty archives from the data core, successfully repelled through the combined efforts of station security, emergency response teams, and Academy staff. 17 intruders were confirmed detained. No student casualties were reported. A handful of injuries among staff and security personnel were noted, treated, and resolved. Nowhere in the report did it mention that a 17-year-old exchange student from Earth had personally accounted for the majority of those 17 detentions. Nowhere did it describe a girl dropping through a maintenance panel into the middle of an armed formation, or clearing a narrow corridor of trained intruders with nothing but a length of scavenged pipe, and instincts that clearly belonged to someone who had faced far worse than this before arriving at Halcyon. I know, because I read every draft of that report before it was finalized. I helped write portions of it myself, at Director Solvane's request, and I chose my words carefully each time, the way Nora had asked me to, weeks earlier, standing beside her in a corridor still hazy with smoke. Director Solvane never fully explained, at least not to me, why he agreed to let the details stay so carefully incomplete. I suspect he understood something during those 11 days of investigation that took me considerably longer to fully accept. Some truths, once written down and confirmed and filed permanently into official record, cannot be quietly returned to uncertainty afterward. Once the galaxy at large knew exactly what one quiet human girl could do under pressure, that knowledge would never again be unknown, and there would be no controlling what anyone eventually chose to do with it. Life at the Academy returned to something resembling normal far more quickly than I expected. Damaged corridors were repaired within a few weeks. New security protocols were implemented, tighter and more cautious than before, though still nowhere near as thorough as they perhaps should have been. Open ring days were suspended indefinitely, a small, quiet acknowledgement from the administration that the old assumptions about this station's safety had not survived the attack, even if the official report pretended otherwise. Nora returned to class 3 days after the attack, her jaw still faintly bruised, a thin scrape healing along her forearm. She sat in her usual seat in the back row, the one with the clearest view of the door, and when I called attendance that morning, she raised 2 fingers, the same as always, and said nothing more. Ethan Marsh and Priya Rao asked her, of course, in the days that followed, what exactly had happened to her during the attack, why she had disappeared for nearly an hour while the rest of the class sheltered in place, why she came back with injuries nobody in the official account could quite explain. She told them, as far as I ever heard, a version of events close enough to the official report to satisfy their curiosity, without revealing much more than that. I do not know whether they fully believed her. I suspect, given time, they eventually stopped asking, the way most people eventually stop asking questions that never quite receive satisfying answers. I found myself watching her differently after that day, and I do not think I was alone in that. Ossavel, normally so composed and philosophical about everything, admitted to me privately, weeks later, that she found herself unconsciously tracking where Nora sat in every shared class after the attack, some instinct telling her that proximity to that particular quiet, unassuming student might, under the right circumstances, be the safest place in any room. I understood the feeling completely, because I had begun doing exactly the same thing myself. I requested a transfer to Earth Relations Studies not long after the investigation concluded, a decision that surprised several of my colleagues, given how thoroughly unremarkable that field had always seemed within Threll academic circles. Earth had never been considered a particularly important system to study closely, not compared to the older, more established interstellar powers our diplomats usually focused on. That perception, I suspected, was about to change, slowly and quietly, whether the wider galaxy fully realized it yet or not. I spoke with Nora one final time before the academic cycle ended, catching her alone near the observation deck, where I had first noticed her strange habit of always facing the door. The station outside the viewport looked calm again, repaired, ordinary, as if the attack had never touched it at all. "Can I ask you something?" I said. She glanced at me, then back toward the stars beyond the viewport. "You can ask. Was that the worst thing you've ever faced? What happened here?" She was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something pass behind her eyes, old and heavy, in a way that made me regret asking almost immediately. "No," she said finally, quietly, "not close." I did not ask her to explain further. I am not certain, even now, that I want to know exactly what she meant by that, or exactly what kind of world produces a 17-year-old who can say something like that so calmly while staring out at open space. "The report doesn't mention what you actually did," I said instead. "Doesn't that bother you? Everyone else on this station gets credit for what happened. You get nothing." She almost smiled at that, though it never quite reached her eyes. "I don't need credit. I need people to keep underestimating us a little while longer. That's worth more to my planet than any report ever could be." I thought about that for a long time afterward, long after Nora Bennett finished her exchange program and returned home to Earth, long after the next incoming class of students arrived at Halcyon, knowing nothing at all about what had happened here months before their arrival. I thought about it while writing my transfer request, and while reading everything I could find about humanity's long, brutal history of conflict, survival, and adaptation, trying to understand exactly what kind of pressure shapes a species capable of producing someone like her, quiet and unassuming right up until the exact moment that quiet stops being useful. I never learned the full story of where Nora Bennett came from, or what exactly had trained her so thoroughly before she ever set foot on this station. I am not certain I ever will. Humans, I have come to understand since that day, are remarkably skilled at revealing exactly as much about themselves as they choose to, and not one measure more. What I do know is this: on one ordinary morning, at a school built specifically to be safe, a class ended early because an alarm interrupted an otherwise unremarkable lecture. And in the chaos that followed, one quiet exchange student from a planet the rest of the galaxy still barely understood, quietly, methodically, without asking permission from anyone, made certain that the true scale of what she was capable of never made it into any official record at all. I think about that often, now, sitting in my new position within Earth Relations Studies, reading reports from other systems that have begun, slowly and cautiously, to interact more closely with humanity as the decades pass. Every report describes the same pattern, if you know to look for it. Humans, wherever they go, are consistently, deliberately unremarkable, right up until the precise moment circumstances demand otherwise, and then, just as quickly, they return to being unremarkable again, leaving behind only the faintest trace of what actually happened, carefully incomplete records, quiet witnesses who choose not to elaborate, and official accounts that never quite capture the full truth. I sometimes wonder what might happen if a species that thinks this way, that plans this carefully, that trains its children this thoroughly, and then teaches them to hide it just as thoroughly, ever decided there was no longer any reason left to hold back. I hope, for the sake of the rest of us, that day never comes, but I no longer believe, the way I once did, that it never could. Class ended early that day at Halcyon Academy. I do not think any of us who were there ever fully stopped paying attention afterward.